Hello everyone and welcome to the DIDIY Case assembly guide. In this video I'm going to walk you through everything you'll need to put together one of these controllers, as well as the actual build process. To start with, let's cover everything that comes in the DIY kits. First up are the keycaps. I'm using DSA Profile PBT keycaps. DSA refers to the shape of the cap and PBT is the type of plastic. Next are the switches. These are 35 gram Gatoron clear switches. We tend towards lighter spring switches because they reduce hand fatigue. These are the MX1S boards. They're a custom PCB that I designed, and all it is a hot swap socket, which is the little black piece, and then a 3-pin screw terminal. To take these apart, you just kind of snap them apart like a KitKat bar. They're very durable, so you don't have to worry about breaking them while you're doing this. And here we have the main component, which is the DIDIY board. And essentially all this is a Raspberry Pi Pico as the microcontroller, and then a bunch of screw terminals and a Model U for the USB port. Special note here, I cut the excess pins off the bottom of these so that they are essentially flush. This is very important when you're using a metal switch plate so that these pins do not touch the metal. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Alright, and the last thing here is the wire. I have 24 gauge solid core wire. That's what will come in the DIY kits. And I'll have two colors. In this case, I'm using green and yellow. I'll be using green for the ground and yellow for signal. Okay, that's it for the parts, so let's move on to tools. You will need 3 tools total, the first of which are a pair of wire strippers. And you don't need to buy the exact ones that I'm showing here, but this is just a good example of what you want to look for. We need a pair that can strip 24 gauge wire. And you'll see on here I have 2 sets of numbers, one for stranded and one for solid. We're using solid core in this case, and this does strip 24 gauge solid core, so this is perfect. And then the other thing you want to look for on a pair of wire strippers are a set of cutters built in. So on my set, they're kind of near the bottom right here. Those are actually cutter teeth. And sometimes you'll see those near the top instead. But either way, you'll just want to find a pair that has those cutters built in. Otherwise, you'd have to buy them separately. And then the other tool we'll need, or the other 2 tools, will be a small flathead screwdriver, as well as a Phillips head screwdriver. And on the note of the flathead screwdriver, it needs to be fairly small, and the reason for that is so that it can fit into the screw terminals. To be specific, you need a number 2 flathead screwdriver. Sometimes you can find these under the name of jeweler screwdrivers, but if you just search on Amazon or Google for small flathead screwdriver, you should be able to find this fairly easily. Any hardware store would sell them as well, but we just need it to be small enough to fit into that small hole there so that we can adjust the screw terminals. Okay, with the tools out of the way, let's move on to the case hardware. This hardware is specific to the DIDIY case, so if you're using a different case, you'll need to find your own hardware. The first thing here are the case screws. These are M5, 25 millimeters long, and we will need 7 of these. The ones I'm showing here are off of Amazon, but I will also have links to the McMaster version of these screws. Next, we have a couple M5 weld nuts, 7 of them to be specific, to line up with our 7 case screws. These are off of McMaster car. Next, we have our DIDIY mounting screws. These are M3 and they're 8 millimeters long, and you will need 4 of them. And here we have the M3 nuts, also for mounting the DIDIY. We will need 4 of these as well. And then last, we have a couple M3 plastic washers. These are needed for spacing the DIDIY board away from the metal switch plate so that the contacts on the bottom of the DIDIY do not touch the metal switch plate. And we will need 8 of these because we will be stacking 2 on each of the screws. Alright, and the last thing you'll need is, of course, the DIDIY case itself. And I will not be selling these cases directly. Instead, I'll be posting all the files necessary to order these from a laser cutting website such as SendCutSend or Pinocchio. And I'll also have a guide on GitHub explaining exactly how to order them, specifically from SendCutSend. All these cases really is a bunch of stacked up layers of acrylic along with a aluminum switch plate. So pretty simple, pretty straightforward. Okay, and with all that out of the way, we can finally get into the actual build process. We're going to start by inserting all of our switches into our aluminum switch plate, and we're going to orient these in a specific way in order to make mounting the MX1S boards a little bit easier. And I actually made a mistake in this video. As you're about to see, I'm going to insert these with the pins facing towards the bottom, but you actually want those pins facing towards the top. So we get to watch me be a big dummy and insert them the wrong way, and then later in the video I'm going to pull them all back out and put them in the correct way. So don't be like me. Make sure those pins are facing towards the top of the panel. There's also a small hole in the top of the switch, and you want that hole to face towards the bottom. So right here as I'm pushing this in, just yeah, don't do that. Just flip them around the other way and you'll be good to go. So we're going to fast forward through this. You can just see how proud I am after putting all the switches in, and I have not yet realized that I put them in the wrong way. But while I'm doing a close-up of these switches, there is something important to note with these. After you insert them all, you want to go through and check the little pins, specifically one that's closest to the edge. If you find any that are bent, we want to straighten those out, and we'll probably check again once we put the MX1S boards on, but make sure that those are all straight. If it's a little bit off, you can just bend it back with your finger like that, and you'll be good to go. Okay, and the next thing we're going to do is get our DIDY board mounted to the switch plate. We're going to need 4 of our M3 screws and 8 of our black plastic spacers. And what you want to do here is turn your panel sideways like so, and insert the 4 screws through the top side of the panel. And now we want to grab some tape. You can use any kind of tape, doesn't have to be electrical. And just put some tape over the top of the screws. This will keep them from falling out when we flip the panel over, and it also holds them in place so that when we're kind of finger tightening the nuts on, they won't fall off. Now we're going to grab our spacers and put 2 of them on each of the screws. Okay, now we're going to place the DIDY board on the screws with the USB port facing towards the top, and we are going to take our M3 nuts and put those on. These are a little bit tricky to put on just because of how small they are, but all you're looking to do is kind of place the nut on and get it flat, and then just kind of spin it on with your finger. We're not looking to really tighten them down yet. We just want to get them in place so that we can then later tighten them using a Phillips head screwdriver from the top. So you can see me kind of struggling here for a second, but once I get it on there flat, it spins on very easily. If it doesn't go on easily, don't just try to force it on. You want to go kind of counterclockwise and make sure that it's flat before you get it on. This one in the bottom right corner is probably going to be the hardest. I was kind of lucky to get it on the first try there, but since it's in between those screw terminals, it's a little bit hard to get to. So now we're just going to do that with the other 2. Okay, now that we have all of those nuts on, I'm just going to show a quick side view here to show why those 8 little spacers are very important. They keep the DIDY from touching the metal switch plate so that nothing shorts out on the DIDY board. I know it looks like the USB port pins are very close to touching, but I did confirm that they're not, so we're all good. And now we're going to pull off our tape from the top, and we need to get these 4 screws tightened down, so we will need our Phillips head screwdriver. And what we're going to do here is just hold the nut from the bottom using your finger and then tighten from the top with the Phillips head screwdriver. This doesn't need to be super tight, and it's okay if the nut kind of spins in place. We just want it firm enough that the DIDY board isn't like sliding around or anything. Right here I'm just showing, you can use your thumb or your finger to just kind of keep that nut from spinning too much. Tighten it just enough that the DIDY board isn't just kind of like sliding around, and then you'll be good to go. Now we're going to move on to installing our MX1S boards, and to do this you'll see that there are 2 little holes for our hot swap socket, and those holes line up with the pins on our switches. And you're about to see why I tell you to orient the pins facing the top not the bottom. I put them in the wrong way, and you're about to see me kind of figure that out and then pull them all out and put them back in. Yes. My horror as I realized that the screw terminals are supposed to be facing the other direction. You could, in theory, actually face them upwards, but especially for the start button and a couple other switches, it makes a lot more sense to have them face downwards. So we're going to now pull all the switches out and put them in correctly. So hopefully you paid attention at the beginning of the video and you did not do what I did here. With the switches now in the correct way, we're going to go ahead and put on our MX1S boards. To do this, all you need to do is push down on the panel so that the switches don't pop out, and then just push the MX1 board on, and that's it. Super simple. You just have to make sure that those two pins slot into the socket properly, and that's it. So we're just going to speed run through these. Once you've put one on, you've pretty much know how to do it. So I'm just going to fast forward through this. And I will pause at one part right here because I actually made a mistake, and this is very worthwhile pointing out. So this one right here, when I went to push it on, it felt a little weird, and when I took it off, I realized that I had bent one of the pins. And this is something you'll have to look out for. It's actually very easy to do, and like I stated earlier, if you do not have those pins straight when you're slotting these on, it is very easy to bend a pin, and you'll see there that it's kind of squished down. But luckily, these are very easy to fix, and I'm going to show you how to do that here. I'm going to take my flathead screwdriver and kind of pull it sort of back into place here to where it's poking up, but we still need it to be straightened out. So I'm going to grab a pair of needle nose pliers and just kind of squish it back into a general straight shape. Doesn't need to be absolutely perfect, just needs to be straight enough to slot into the hot swap socket. Now we're going to take our MX1S board and try slotting that on again, and it looks like it went on properly that time, so the day is saved. Now we're going to start the most fun part of the build, and by most fun I mean most tedious, and what this is the ground daisy chain. And all a ground daisy chain is just us connecting all of the ground points on all of the switches all together. And on the MX1S boards, the reason they have 3 slots is to make this process a little bit easier. So the 2 outer slots on all of the boards are actually both ground, so you can use either one. And you'll see here in a second why that's going to make routing our wires a little bit easier. And what I'm doing here is measuring out a length of wire to connect these 2 switches together. And once I get a length that I like, I will cut it using my wire strippers with those little snippers at the bottom, and then I'm going to strip off a small length of wire so that we can put them into our screw terminals. I apologize for the slightly blurry image here, but all you're going to do is insert the wire into your 24 gauge hole, snip, and then pull off the excess. It's very simple, very easy. And you should be left with about that much wire exposed. I don't have an exact measurement off the top of my head, but yeah, about there. It doesn't need to be exactly perfect. You know, it can be a little bit more than that or a little bit less than that. I try to err on the side of it being a little less than that. And now we're just going to loosen the screws on our screw terminals. They come all tightened down, so you will need to do this on every single one. You'll just turn them counterclockwise just a little bit to unscrew them. You don't need to unscrew them all the way or anything. You actually only need to turn your screwdriver maybe 2 or 3 rotations at most. And then once you've got those loosened up, we can take our wire and stick one end into one of the terminals and then tighten that down. And you don't need to get this super tight or anything. It just needs to be tight enough so that the wire doesn't yank out. And if the screw terminal kind of wiggles, that's totally fine. That's normal. Just from the way they're designed, they will wiggle a little bit when you're tightening it. And I had a little mishap here where my wire broke off on the end. I stripped a little bit too much off, and I think I squeezed my strippers a little bit too hard, and I broke off the end of it. So I'm just going to re-strip that here, and we'll try that again. All right, you'll have to excuse my immaculate camera work. I know you can't really see the bottom one there, but you should be able to see the top one. And all I'm doing is just inserting the wire and then tightening down the screw to the point that the wire does not pop out. You don't need to tighten these super hard, as I've already mentioned, just enough to where you can put a little bit of pressure on the wire and it doesn't pop out. And as long as you can do that, then they are fully connected. Everything is good to go. And then we just have to do this over and over and over on the rest of the switches. Like I said, it's a bit of a tedious process, but once you get into the rhythm of it, you can get your wires cut to length, strip the wire off, stick the wire in and screw it down just over and over, and it should go pretty fast. So I'm going to fast forward through most of this because, again, once you've seen it done once, it's pretty much the same every other time. Now, as to how the wires are routed specifically, that is up to you. My method for wiring in this video is probably not the best. There's a bunch of different ways you could do this, but if you want to go off of the way I did it in the video, it definitely will work. The only thing that you need to do is just make sure that every single switch is connected to every single other switch. And whether you use the exact same layout as me, it doesn't matter. Just as long as they're all connected, that's what's important. So we will fast forward here and I'll come back when I have a couple more of these wired. All right, I'm going to pause right here and show something that I'm doing. I'm placing one of the middle layers of the DIDY case to kind of ensure that all of my wires are going to fit within the case. There's a couple switches, MY, as well as I believe it is mid shield over on the left hand side, are kind of close to the edge of the case, so it's important that you make sure those wires are not actually hitting the sides of the case and that they will fit with inside of it. So I'll kind of occasionally take that middle panel and set it over the top to make sure my wires are not in the way of the case. All right, we're nearing the end of the ground chain here, and the last thing you need to do once you've connected all the switches together is you need to connect any of the ground points to the DIDY itself. There is a ground pin on the far left side of the DIDY, and what I chose to do is to actually insert 2 wires into one of the screw terminals, specifically the start button, and then I'm going to run this wire over to the ground pin on the DIDY. I realized after the fact that I probably could have run a wire from one of the empty slots. With the way I wired everything up, I actually had an empty terminal slot over on, I believe it's the B button. It's kind of in the top left corner. My hand's covering it here, but I could have done that instead of doing this, but it is an option. You can actually run 2 wires into a single terminal, but with that last wire connected here, the ground daisy chain is now completed. You do want to go back through and kind of tug on each of those wires, make sure none of them are popping out and everything is securely in place. But this is my wiring layout. If you want to copy me, or if you kind of want to come up with your own, maybe a better method of doing this so there's not so many crossing wires, but regardless, this did work, as long as all of the switches are connected to each other and then they are connected to the DIDY in one spot, then you are 100% good to go and we can move on to the next step. All right, now we can get into the last bit of wiring, and what we're doing here is connecting the center pin of each of the MX1S boards to the corresponding terminal on the DIDY board itself. and you do want to stick to the default layout when you're doing this. If you want to do any kind of remapping, that can be done later through the firmware, but it's going to make your life much easier to just stick to the default layout. So if you need to reference, since we have the board flipped over, it's kind of hard to like visualize which switch is which in the default layout when it's flipped like this. So I will have a picture that you can reference in the description for this video to kind of show you which button is supposed to be connected to each pin on the DIDY. But basically, this is pretty much the same process as the ground daisy chain. We're just going to measure out lengths of wire, cut and then strip them, and then just connect them to our terminals on the MX1S boards. One thing to note here really quick, you can see here that I'm having to connect a pin that is on the right side of the DIDY board to a button that is on the left side of the case. So I kind of have to cross from the right side over to the left. Makes it a little bit messy. This is definitely an oversight on my part when I was designing the DIDY boards, and it's something that will be corrected on newer versions. I basically laid out the buttons as if the DIDY board was flipped, and so I kind of have to cross the wire from right to left. Looks a little bit weird, doesn't affect the functionality whatsoever, but just worth noting that it will be fixed on future revisions. Alright, I've got all of my buttons wired up to the DIDY now. You definitely want to go back through and kind of slightly tug on each of those wires to make sure they are securely attached to each of the screw terminals. But that is it for the wiring. We're now 100% done with that. Now would be a great time to take your board and plug it in. You can just use that onboard USB-C port, and it will come pre-flashed with firmware, so you should just be able to plug in and test out your buttons on Dolphin, make sure everything's working, and then as soon as you have double checked that, we can move on to actually putting the case together. The process for putting the case together is very simple. But before we do that, we need to take the protective coating off all of our acrylic layers. Yours might come with a clear or blue plastic on. Mine came with this kind of white papery substance. It's a little bit hard to get this off, but you do need to take it off before assembly. It will not be easy to take it off after the fact. And you will, to some extent, get some dust and fingerprints on the acrylic. It's pretty much completely unavoidable. I've just given up at this point. I don't really care about fingerprints and dust getting on them. But if you are really concerned about that, you can, wear gloves. It's a little bit hard wearing gloves because, you kind of need to get your fingernail on there and peel off one of the edges. But, you can do all kinds of stuff to try to keep the dust off. But at the end of the day, acrylic is just kind of prone to it. It's something you'll have to accept. You could potentially use other materials, but I always recommend clear acrylic because it's very inexpensive. If you do start getting into different colors of acrylic or different materials altogether, you can end up increasing the price quite a bit. So, it is what it is. The dust and the fingerprints are something that you'll just kind of have to live with. But, we'll walk through, take off this protective material off all our panels. And once that's done, we can actually start putting it together. With these middle layers, you want to be a little bit careful when you're peeling off the protective coating. Since most of the panel is hollowed out and it's only 3mm thick acrylic, you just want to kind of hold it in place when you're peeling off the coating and be a little bit gentle with it. If you are overly aggressive, there is somewhat of a potential to crack the acrylic, but as long as you're kind of holding it in place, taking your time, you should not have any issues with it. It's just something worth noting. Now that we have all our panels peeled off and stacked up, we just need to insert our hardware. And to do that, I like to put the case up on its side and kind of hold it in place with one of my hands, and then take a weld nut and put that into one of the holes. You may need to kind of stack these up like, you know, when you're stacking papers, that kind of thing, to get them lined up. But the weld nut should go in pretty easily, and so should your screw. And then you're just going to finger tighten these screws. I'll usually do 2 on the top side and then flip it over and do 2 on the, or excuse me, 1 on the bottom side, and then get those all finger tight. And that is pretty much it. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward. Now, before I tighten down all of the screws, I like to go around and kind of reposition each of the weld nuts in a somewhat organized way. I'll spin the corner ones so that they're kind of angled towards the curve of the case, and then the 3 middle ones, I'll just kind of have them slanted flat so that they line up with the edges. And then all you have to do is take your Phillips head screwdriver and tighten these down. And kind of like with everything else on this project, you do not need to tighten these down super hard. We are squishing together a bunch of layers of acrylic, so if you like really over tighten these, there's a potential to crack that acrylic. Again, that would be an extreme scenario. You know, as long as you're just tightening them down, you know, finger tight, there should not be any problems. But you know, you just want it enough to where the layers aren't like moving around or anything. And that is pretty much it. Now our absolute final step is just putting on our keycaps. By far the easiest part. All you have to do is just push these onto the stems. If they don't go on easily, try rotating the keycap by 90 degrees and then putting them on again. So you'll see, I think it's this one that gives me trouble. I just pull it off, turn it once, and then push it back on, and it should go on very easily, just like that. And once you've got those all on, you are 100% done. You've got yourself a controller. And yeah, thanks for watching.